The sound of the car didn't belong there. It cut through the quiet mountain air like something foreign, sharp, heavy, out of place. A black luxury car stopped right in front of the small house. Dust rose slowly around its wheels. The engine turned off. Silence followed. Inside the yard, Trieu Duong was splitting wood. He paused. The axe stopped mid-air. Tieu Van, who had been sitting quietly near the doorway, froze. Her fingers tightened unconsciously. Her breathing changed. She didn't need to see it clearly. She already knew. "They found me," she whispered. The car door opened. One, then another. Two people stepped out, dressed neatly, cold expressions, unfamiliar to this place, but painfully familiar to her. "Tieu Phong." The voice was firm, unemotional. She didn't move. Trieu Duong slowly put the axe down, then stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of her. "Who are you?" he asked calmly, but his body was already on guard. "We're here to take her back." No greeting, no explanation, just a statement, as if she were something to be retrieved, not a person. Tieu Van's hands trembled, her eyes lowered. "Let's go," the woman said again. "We've wasted enough time." "I'm not going," Tieu Van whispered. The words were soft, but clear. The man scoffed. "You don't get to decide that." Trieu Duong stepped forward, blocking the path completely. "She said she's not going." His voice was steady, but his eyes sharp. The tension thickened instantly. "You don't understand what you're interfering with," the man said, his tone turning colder. "I understand enough," Trieu Duong replied. Behind him, a small sound. "Chuk lam styret." Tieu Van instinctively turned. Her eyes softened for just a second. Then fear returned. "Do you really think you can give him a future?" The woman's voice cut through the air again. "Look at this place." Her eyes scanned the house, the yard, the life they had. Poverty, nothing, each word like a blade. Tieu Phong flinched, because deep down she knew they weren't lying. "Come back," the woman continued. "You still have a life waiting for you. Don't throw it away for a mistake." A mistake. The word hung in the air, heavy, cruel. Tieu Van's eyes filled, but she didn't cry. Not this time. Trieu Duong clenched his jaw. "That mistake is her son," he said quietly. "And what can you give him?" The man shot back immediately. "Love," he scoffed. "Love doesn't build a future." Silence. The words hit exactly where they needed to. Trieu Duong didn't answer, because for a moment he didn't know how to. Tieu Van looked at him, then at the baby, then back at the car. Her past, her present, her choice. "If you were me right now," her voice trembled slightly, "would you go back? Or stay here and lose everything again?" No one answered, because the answer was inside her. She took a step forward. Trieu Duong's heart tightened, but he didn't stop her. He just watched, as she walked past him, closer to the car. Each step heavy, painful, like she was walking away from something. Again. Then she stopped, right before reaching them. Her hands clenched. Her shoulders trembled. "I'm not going back." The words came out stronger this time. Clear, firm. The woman's expression darkened. "Think carefully," she said coldly. "If you walk away now, don't expect to come back again." Tieu Van didn't hesitate. "I won't." Silence. Then the car door slammed shut. The engine started again. And just like that, they left, leaving behind dust and something else. Freedom or consequences. No one knew yet. Tieu Van stood there, still. Then slowly her body gave in. She dropped to her knees, not from weakness, but from everything she had just held inside. Trieu Duong walked over, didn't say anything, just stood beside her. Then gently he picked up Truck Lamb. The baby stirred, then reached out, toward her. Tieu looked up, tears falling silently. And this time she didn't hesitate. She held his small hand. "I stayed," she whispered. Duong looked at her. "I know." The tension slowly faded. The air felt lighter. "Let's go," he said suddenly. She looked up, confused. "Where?" He adjusted the baby, strapping him carefully against his chest. "To the market."
Tieu blinked.
"What?" He smiled slightly. "You haven't eaten properly since you got here." She stared at him. After everything that just happened, after that choice, he was thinking about food? "Come on," he said, already reaching for the old motorbike. The engine coughed to life. The baby rested against his chest. Safe, warm. Tieu hesitated for a moment. Then slowly, she climbed on behind him. The road stretched ahead. Rough, dusty, but real. The wind brushed past her face. And for the first time, she didn't feel like she was running away. She was moving forward. Together, the road to the market was rough, uneven, covered in dust and scattered stones. But the motorbike moved forward steadily, the old engine humming under the weight of 3 people. 1 man, 1 woman, and a baby resting quietly between them. Tieu sat behind Duong. First, she didn't dare hold on to him. Her hands hovered in the air, unsure, hesitant, like everything else she had done since coming back. Then the bike hit a small bump. Her body jolted forward. Instinctively, she grabbed onto his shirt. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The baby stirred slightly, his small head resting against Duong's chest. Peaceful, trusting. The wind blew stronger as they moved deeper into the mountain road. It brushed against Tieu's face, drying the tears she hadn't realized were still there. "Are you cold?" Duong asked suddenly, not turning back. She shook her head, then realized he couldn't see. "No," she said softly. A short pause. "Hold tighter," he added. She hesitated. Then slowly, her hands tightened around him. This time, she didn't let go. The road stretched on. Villagers passed by, some carrying baskets, some walking slowly with familiar routines. They glanced at the motorbike, at the man, at the baby, at the woman behind him, curious, but not judging, because in places like this, life wasn't perfect, and neither were people. The market appeared slowly in the distance. A small open space, simple wooden stalls, voices overlapping, the smell of fresh vegetables, cooked food, and earth. It wasn't grand. It wasn't clean. It wasn't anything like the world Tieu had come from. But it was alive. Duong stopped the bike, turned off the engine. The sudden silence felt strange after the constant sound of movement. He adjusted the baby carefully, making sure Truck Lamb was secure against his chest. "Let's go," he said. Tieu stepped down slowly. Her feet touched the ground. But for a second, she didn't move. She looked around, at the narrow paths, at the worn wooden tables, at the people laughing, bargaining, calling out. This place was nothing like her past. And yet, something about it felt real. "You don't have to be scared," Duong said quietly beside her. "I'm not scared," she replied, but her voice was softer than before. They walked together, side by side. The baby looked around, his eyes wide, taking in the colors, the movement, the sounds. A woman from a nearby stall smiled. "Your son is adorable," she said.
Tieu franche.
Duong didn't. "Thank you," he replied naturally. Then, without thinking, he added, "We're taking care of him together." Tieu looked at him. He didn't look back, But something in his words stayed with her. They stopped at a vegetable stall. Duong picked up fresh greens, checked them carefully. "Too expensive," he muttered. The seller laughed. "You always say that."
Tieu van watched.
This version of him was different. Simple, honest, real. Not impressive, not powerful, but steady. "Do you always come here?" she asked. "Every few days," he replied. She nodded slowly, then reached out, picked up a vegetable, examined it. The seller raised an eyebrow. "You know how to choose?" Tieu gave a faint smile. "I'm learning." The woman laughed. "Good, then you'll fit in here." The words were light, casual, but they landed deeply. Fit in. Tieu hadn't felt that in a long time. They continued walking, buying small things, simple ingredients. Nothing expensive, nothing luxurious, but enough, more than enough. At one point, the baby reached out toward a small hanging toy.
Tieu van noticed.
Without thinking, she stepped closer, lifted it slightly, let him touch it. He didn't cry. He smiled. A small moment, but real. She froze for a second. Then slowly, she smiled too. "Did you see that?" she whispered. Duong glanced over. "I did." His voice was calm, but softer than before. They finished shopping and returned home the same way. The ride felt shorter, lighter. When they arrived, the sun was already beginning to set. A warm orange light covered the yard. Tieu stepped inside first. She placed the ingredients on the table, then stood there, looking at them. "What do you usually cook?" she asked. "Simple things," Duong replied. She nodded. Then, without saying anything else, she rolled up her sleeves. "I'll cook," she said. He looked at her, a little surprised. "You don't have to." "I want to." The answer came quickly, firm. He didn't argue. Instead, he sat nearby, holding the baby, watching. Tieu moved slowly at first, careful, unfamiliar with the small kitchen. But gradually, her movements became more natural. She cut vegetables, washed rice, lit the stove. The fire crackled softly. The smell of food began to fill the space. Warm, comforting. Duong didn't say anything, but his eyes stayed on her, because this moment was different, not forced, not fragile, just real. "Does it smell okay?" she asked suddenly, glancing back. He nodded. "Yeah." A small pause. Then he added, "It smells like home."
Tieu van Franche.
Just for a second, then turned back to the stove. But this time her lips curved slightly, because for the first time, she didn't feel like someone who didn't belong. She felt like someone who had chosen to stay. The fire burned steadily, soft, warm, alive. Tieu stood in front of the small stove, her hands moving slowly, carefully, as if every motion mattered more than it should. The vegetables sizzled lightly in the pan. Steam rose into the dim light, carrying with it a simple, comforting smell. Behind her, Duong sat quietly. Truck lamb rested against his chest, half awake, his tiny fingers gripping the fabric like always. The room felt different. Not empty, not tense, just quiet. The kind of quiet that didn't hurt. Tieu placed the last dish on the table. 3 simple plates, a bowl of soup, some vegetables, a small dish of meat. Nothing special, nothing luxurious, but she stood there for a moment, looking at it. Then she turned. "It's ready." Her voice was soft, almost unsure. Duong nodded. He stood up slowly, adjusting the baby in his arms before walking over. He sat down, placed truck lamb carefully in a small cloth cradle beside them. For a second, no one moved. The food was there, warm, waiting. But something else needed to happen first. Sit, he said.
Tieu van hesitated.
Then slowly, she sat across from him. The distance between them wasn't far, but it wasn't close either. Not yet. Trieu Duong picked up his chopsticks, tasted the food. He didn't say anything right away. Tieu Ven watched him, her hands clenched slightly on her lap. Well? She asked, trying to sound calm. He looked up. It's good. Just 2 words. But they landed deeper than anything else. Tieu Ven let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. She picked up her chopsticks. They ate, slowly, quietly, not awkward, not forced, just peaceful. In the middle of the meal, a small sound. Both of them looked at the same time. Truck Lam had woken up. His eyes moved, searching. For a second, he looked at Trieu Duong, then at Tieu Ven, and this time he didn't hesitate. He made a small sound, reached out, not strongly, not fully, but enough.
Tieu van Franche.
Her eyes widened, her breath caught. She didn't move immediately, as if she was afraid that even hope could break this moment. Go on, Trieu Duong said quietly. She looked at him. He nodded slightly. That was all. Slowly, she stood up, walked over, and this time when she reached out, her hands didn't shake as much. She lifted Truck Lam, gently, carefully, and this time he didn't cry. He didn't push her away. He just stayed.
Tieu Ven's lips trembled.
Her eyes filled instantly. She held him close, as if afraid he might disappear again. I'm here, she whispered, and for the first time those words didn't feel empty. Trieu Duong watched. His chest tightened, but it wasn't pain. Not like before. It was something else. Something quieter. Acceptance. He stood up slowly, walked closer, not to take the child, but to stand beside them. Truck Lam looked between them. Then he reached out again. One hand toward her, one hand toward him. Tieu Ven let out a small sob. Trieu Duong smiled faintly, and this time neither of them hesitated. They both moved closer. Together, the space between them closed. Not completely, but enough. If you were here right now, Trieu Duong said softly, his voice calm, steady, would you still think love has to choose? No answer came, because the answer was right in front of them. A child who didn't belong to one side, but to both. The night fell slowly outside. The wind softened. The world quieted. Inside that small house, 3 people sat together. Not perfect, not complete, but no longer broken. Tieu Ven looked at Truck Lam, then at Trieu Duong. I won't leave again, she said. This time her voice didn't shake. Trieu Duong didn't reply immediately. He just looked at her, then nodded. A small gesture, but enough. Because sometimes trust doesn't come from promises. It comes from staying. Truck Lam let out a soft laugh. And in that moment, everything felt lighter. Not solved, not finished, but possible. The fire in the kitchen slowly died down. The last light faded. And in the quiet of that night, a new beginning formed. Not from perfection, but from choice. To stay, to try, to not walk away again.